You are listening to the Mythical Jesus podcast, taking the Christ of faith seriously. A podcast that dives into faith development, cognitive development, using Jesus as the framework for that. We dive deep into the Jesus of the New Testament, showing him as the preeminent example of development and what that development looks like. Buckle your seatbelts. Sit back, enjoy the ride. This is going to be a lot of fun because diving into the Jesus narrative has never been done like this before. You can visit our website at christoffaith.org. On the site, you will find tools, resources, documents to help you in your faith development and to better understand Jesus. Jesus podcast, how are you today?
I'm doing really good, Bill. How are you?
I'm doing awesome. I'm grateful for this chance to sit down with you. We're going to have a conversation today around cognitive development, and I'm really looking forward to this. Before we jump into some of these questions, these ideas and concepts, I'm wondering if you might just give the listeners kind of a brief intro, as much as you want to tell us about yourself and kind of your background.
Yeah, no, I'd be happy to. Yeah, I've really had a lifelong interest and passion around human development, spirituality, social change, organizational change, and I've been working actively in that kind of work for the past 20 years or so. I started an organization with some friends and colleagues called Pacific Integral about 15 years ago, and we've been putting on transformative development programs during that time, most notably the Generating Transformative Change program, which is run in the U.S. and in Australia and New Zealand, and also has been run in Africa. And it's an integrally informed 9-month deep development program that fosters the growth of both individual and collective life and leadership. So our work has been really at the juncture of individual growth, transformation and consciousness, and social change. And I mean that broadly in the sense of transformation of communities, families, organizations, larger social systems, and leadership. And before doing this work, I was in the technology world for a while. I'm a parent. I'm a musician and just an ordinary human being, kind of on an exploration and an experimental life, exploring these territories and learning just like you.
Oh, beautiful. So I'll share a little bit of a personal background and tie it into kind of what I want to go into next, which is that to find developmental theory, to get into cognitive development, I think all of us, we don't just happen to fall into this and go like, hey, that's an interesting subject. It feels like most people I talk to, and again, you're welcome to disagree and give me a completely different experience than what I'm used to running into. But in my world, people are raised in systems, often religious systems, and in those systems, some type of fracture happens. And when that fracture happens, they often feel lonely and they don't know how to make sense of the world. So they go looking. And when I went looking, I found things like Ken Wilber's Spiral Dynamics. But even before that, I found James Fowler's Stages of Faith, William Perry's Cognitive and Ethical Development, people like Kohlberg. And I came across books like Janet Hagberg and Robert Gulich, The Critical Journey, and other books that spoke on this development. And then, of course, it runs through stages. And when we're in those earlier stages, we often think we've arrived, and hence we're not really open to hearing about how we've just begun the journey. I'm just curious, what drew you into this field? Like, what took you to a space where you're like, hey, I'm interested in development and I want to know what these stages look like?
That's a great question. I think there's a few things. I mean, one of the things that's really driven me to my own exploration and to learning about human development and growth and all of that is my own suffering. You know, and I honestly feel like that's really, it's at the heart of a lot of this kind of work, is that is that we struggle and we want to find answers, and there's a kind of impulse to an evolutionary tension that we experience just through the own painful experiences that we have in life. And for me, my own early life as a child of divorce and a family that in some ways fell apart, and my own experience of that, I really sought to, I was seeking something. So that's part of it. Part of it is kind of my own experiences of insight and awakening, and as I started to explore, having kind of ahas or shifts or altered states of consciousness or insights that began to point to, like, oh, there's something new and different, and it really, like, kind of fanned the flame of my own existential inquiries. And then I can also, frankly, Bill, look at it as spirit moving through me. So, like, we often say, well, what drew you to this? It's like, what draws us to anything? It's at some level, it's a kind of profound mystery, yet we're drawn. And we all in some ways there seems to be an impulse in life towards something greater and more whole. And that's a kind of, I think, a kind of broad reflection to your question. My own spiritual journey took some ins and outs in my teenage and 20s, and as I was trying to find my own kind of self in the world and that kind of thing. But it really took on form when my first son was born. And I think as I look back on that moment, I didn't really know what was happening at the time, but there was just some profound power and mystery to that experience of having a child, which is still, every day in my life, is a deep blessing and teacher. And so I think at that time it really began to open things up, and that was at the time when I was also stepping out of, as you say, kind of the social framework that I had grown up in, and I started to look for, have a sense of a kind of more authentic path and exploration of different perspectives. And so it began a period of my life of really exploring spirituality, and that evolved in different ways. And then at a certain point, I became aware of the work of Ken Wilber, and that brought me into a whole new set of understanding about many different perspectives on this topic, and explored psychology and spirituality and integral philosophy and developmental psychology and many different aspects of it, as I began to see, oh, there's a bigger picture here. Like you say, this is part of a much larger story, and we're somewhere in the middle of it to the beginning of it. I don't know where we are on it, but it's we're somewhere beyond the Big Bang and not yet enlightenment.
Yeah, one has to wonder. One has to wonder, if we were to go back a million years and look at some of these early hominoid species, and whatever stage they were collectively at, and what was the maximum stage one could reach in that development. And obviously it wouldn't be, some of the stages that we have in these later diagrams today wouldn't even exist then. So you have to wonder if there's even perhaps a stage or two that's beyond kind of what we think is the ceiling at present in the future of the human species. I want to ask you this, which is, again, for me, and I'm speaking to people who are thinking about religious paradigms, and when they think about the fractures that happen within religious paradigms, someone like James Fowler, for instance, speaks to faith development, and we kind of see it just from that angle. But as you point out, it encompasses every facet of life. It really is the human experience. It isn't just happening inside a religion. It isn't happening just inside a high demand fundamentalist religion. It happens in all of them. It happens outside of religion. It happens in our jobs and in our marriages and our relationships with our children. What I want to ask is this, which is that development, you and I understand that it's important. I can speak to the fact that I thought it was important because it gave me a framework that showed me I wasn't alone, and it gave me a framework I could help others see that gave them a roadmap as well to see that this wasn't just a religious experience. This was a human experience, and whether it happened in this religion or another, whether it happened even outside of religion, if one's open to it, life has a way of waking us all up to moving into later stages. Why, but here's my question. Why is it important to human development? Why? We all understand on an individual level. Why collectively? What is going on with the human species right now? And why is this kind of idea something that's going to be helpful if humanity on a larger scale could wrap their arms around this?
Well, that's a good question. Yeah, no, that's really a good question. It's a big question too. It's a really big question. I'm a bit daunted by it.
It is. Why? But why so at Pacific Integral, for instance, why we obviously working with individuals, you're helping each person kind of wake up to their own life.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But what's happening collectively with humanity right now?
Right.
Why is this useful to them?
Yeah, no, I get it. Well, there's a couple of things that I think I want to answer the question from a couple of different perspectives, which might in some ways seem to conflict with each other, but it maybe will fill out a couple of dimensions. One of the things to note is, like, we're talking about, we're doing this, talking about this in the context of cognitive development and adult development theory and those kinds of things, where we begin to understand. So in case not everybody's aware of that, that's an understanding that our mind, our consciousness continues to grow and evolve, has the potential to continue and grow and evolve throughout life, in not just through experience or gaining kind of practical wisdom or skills or things like that, but in the same way that a child goes through profound paradigm shifts and transformations in the level of capacity and complexity, that they go through when they're growing up, that adults can do that too. We've had a kind of myth about what it is, and I think it's both a myth, and I think it's a bit of a cognitive limitation too that might be innate. But we've had a kind of understanding that, like, when you grow up and you're a kid and you grow up, you go through all of these like massive changes. It's like, I remember as a parent of a young child, you go away on a business trip and you come back a week later and you're like, oh my God, look what my child is doing now. And it's like, it's amazing. And then, but the other side of that story is that we become an adult, and then that's kind of where it stops. And there's actually, not that we don't continue to grow and gain skills and stuff and have successes, but the kind of dramatic change that people go through when they're young is childhood development. But what the research shows is, and I just want to kind of put this in as a kind of stake in the ground, the research shows is that we can continue to go through really transformative, qualitative shifts in our capacity as we evolve through life. And one of the reasons that, we theorize that we don't necessarily do that is that you kind of grow to the cultural center of gravity. And to grow beyond that requires, kind of popping out of that culture. So if you're embedded in a kind of specific culture, you can kind of grow up to that, right? And you can kind of learn to fit in and kind of make sense at that level. But then to grow beyond that is painful, because you have to move out of that culture. You have to find a different context, whether it's education or whatever. or a different, group of people that stimulate you to grow beyond that, or maybe just the innate, readiness does. And so, having said that, there's one of the things that we know from development is that you can grow to greater spans of complexity and thinking, of care, of ethical development, of ability to take perspectives. So a very simple thing, if you look out at the world today, is it's rife with conflict, and division and polarization. And if we look at that through the lens of adult development, through developmental theory, we know that there's a path to grow to greater levels of integration and coherence. So there's every reason to think that if we can grow up as a larger society, we can learn to be more effective in addressing the challenges and problems that we have, to really creating, a better, a better life on Earth, a better human existence. And so, in a way, the question kind of has the answer in it to me, which is that we're here to evolve and to be better as human beings, not just individually and collectively. And what this kind of understanding points to is that there's every potential for that. Now, the other kind of perspective I wanted to bring is that I want to just caution that growing doesn't necessarily make us a better person. It's a kind of it's a kind of paradoxical thing, but we have to just look at the whole endeavor of becoming more human, more just, more caring, more integrated, beyond just the perspective of developmental stages, because there's much more to it. So I just want to say that too, that if you look at it in the broadest sense, to me the project here is really to help create a world that is more whole and just and caring and beautiful and sanctified and living up to our potential. Does that answer your question?
Absolutely. It's
Okay.
a beautiful thing when we, you point to this idea of just being kinder to each other. As you and I both know, and again, I run into a problem where I often think of these stages as the later stages are better than the stages behind. And it's easy for us to sometimes use them as a weapon, or to judge others based on the fact that we think we're in this stage and that person's in this stage behind. So I don't want to address it in that way, but I do want to speak to this idea that when we are in a stage that's deeply planted in ethnocentricity, where there's us and them, it's a binary stage. We associate with our like-minded tribes, and anybody in our tribe can be trusted and is good and one of us, and anybody outside of our tribe is bad, and anything they say should be understood with skepticism. And yet, as you just pointed out, if we collectively as humanity can grow out of that stage and can appreciate diversity and begin to see other humans who are very diverse as also us, then it feels like the violence in the world would depreciate significantly. And I assume you, on some level at least, while recognizing that people can develop and still develop new shadows and flaws, that perhaps collectively violence would be significantly diminished by us moving collectively out of ethnocentricity as our main footing or our main ground.
Yes, I think it's what I would say is it's really necessary, but perhaps not sufficient. But I do think over the long run that growing out of that either or mindset sets the seeds and the conditions that we can come to have a more encompassing view of who we are and the community that we're in. We can be responsible not just for ourselves or our tribe or church or our country or our organization or, our whatever we can be responsible for all, really. Yeah.
Yeah, you said not sufficient, and I want to push there, and I want to see what your thoughts are. Like, so you're saying essentially, as we move out of ethnocentricity, that's a great step, but it's not sufficient. Would you expound on that?
Yeah. Well, let's just say it's not a bad thing that it's not sufficient. I'm just like you said, Bill. We have to, we can kind of think that later stages are better than earlier stages and that kind of thing. I'm just, and in the conversation, I'll probably continue to do this. I kind of put a little asterisk by what I say, which is a kind of cautionary note, that there's, we just want to make sure that we're considering everything that we need to consider. And so I'll just give you an example is let's just consider shadow and the unconscious in this. We can grow to quite late stages of development, but we still have ethnocentric parts of ourselves. And those can be unconscious, and we can act them out unconsciously. We have parts of our unconscious cognition that are based in our tribal past. And so it's paradoxical because it's necessary for us to actually grow beyond that ethnocentric consciousness to start to notice those parts of ourselves and to engage with them. But I'll just give you a data point, right? Which is that, if you look at the 20th century, a lot of the damage that has been done from modern consciousness. So, and I know that each stage there'll be damage that we do, and it's just part of human nature that we're evolving and becoming more complete. But I do think that development creates a more holistic consciousness that's more integrative, that's less divisive, and has all of the potential for ending conflict.
Yeah, I love that.
So I'm sort of saying yes with an asterisk that there's that we can still, there are other parts of ourselves that need to develop.
Yeah, beautiful.
Yeah.
I love the idea that if we leave ethnocentricity, but we use, for instance, development as a weapon, all we've done is created
Mm-hmm.
another either or us them kind of paradigm.
Right. 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 It's the mind is a kind of either or device. It tends to, distinguish and divide things into polarities. And one of the things in one of the developmental models that we've worked with was created by my co-founder of Pacific Integral Park, Terry O'Fallon, who created the stages model. And one of the patterns that that she identified in development is this pattern of moving from a kind of polarized position where we're in that kind of either or thinking that you're talking about to more both and then integrative or interpenetrative understanding of things, but that we do that like we go through multiple iterations of that as we become more aware. So there's when we're kids, it's either your toy or my toy. It's black and white. And then we learn that we can share that, right? So it's you can have it for a minute and then I'll have it for a minute. It's a sort of both and where we have reciprocity, right? And then we grow up towards adulthood, we grow a more subtle mind, and then that pattern repeats. So, we learn to share our toys, but then when we're a tech entrepreneur, we won't share our intellectual property. It's my intellectual property. So we go back to that pattern of like being divisive at a more subtle level, and then we say, okay, well, let's go to open source, which is more sort of like sharing our toys. And the same thing happens at a more refined level at what she calls the meta-aware stage, where we have parts of ourselves that we're just becoming aware of, but that we're a bit polarized about, and then those become more integrated. So so development progresses, but it's also a kind of iterating pattern where we go through the process over and over again. And so it's good not to be too idealistic about the later stages.
Oh, I love that. I love it.
Does that make sense what I'm saying?
No, it absolutely does. That essentially we never really, like, as much as we would like to think like, oh, I moved out of egocentricity or I moved out of ethnocentricity, I'm still there every day of my life. We never leave it behind. We carry it with us. And so the more that we can be aware of this developmental framework, the more we can be self-conscious of when we're dipping our toes from stage to stage, and maybe even intentionally still hold that stage, because it may be useful for various things in our life, but also recognizing like to be vulnerable to it, to be, I'm trying to think what the word is, to be willing to essentially like see your own shadows. And I think often it's hardest to see it in ourselves. So I do love that. I want to hit on, because what it brings up for me is this idea that, again, if I look across time and space and I look at human development over the last, say, million years with whatever human beings were a million years ago, and there's this recognition that putting ourselves in tribes, putting ourselves in groups, learning certain ways in which, like, I know that this person's a person from my tribe because of these characteristics, and hence I can trust them, would have been absolutely essential to that stage, that time, that moment in our world's history, for a forager and a gatherer, for a hunter, for them to go about with 10 or 12 of their tribesmen to go hunt some animal, and to know that they can trust each one to carry out their duty and responsibility. But as we're now in 2018, and not that we don't need that still, but one of the things I want to hit on is this idea of authority. And so in development, we often hit a stage, and again, it usually, for me at least, I put these simple labels on of ethnocentricity when I recognize like there's several stages, even with that being the center ground. The idea that in ethnocentricity, we often have outer authorities inside our tribe, and we trust them to know the truth. We trust them to have all the answers. And this can be the President of the United States. It can be a teacher in a classroom. It can be our parents. It can be our football coach. It can be 100 different people, but we always see them as insider, and we see them as, because they're outside of us, we trust them to be the experts. And as we enter into later stages, somehow that gets fractured, and we begin to sense like, oh, they don't have all the answers. And we begin to move to a space where we start to listen to other voices outside our tribe, kind of testing them, and then eventually move into a place where we kind of develop an inner authority, where we begin to say, like, I know my leader of my tribe is saying ABC, but it doesn't feel right, and I'm going to go with my gut. I wonder if maybe you could speak to that process in a sense of maybe helping us understand maybe what moves us, what kind of things are happening that move us from a locus of authority outside of ourselves, but in the tribe, to opening ourselves up to hearing voices of wisdom in other places, including ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a really good question. So you're speaking to a really particular kind of segment of the developmental pathway, and I like the term authority. If I could start just by distinguishing that a little bit, I want to, if you could say that an ethnocentric stage, because there's a couple of different forms of authority that are really close to each other that you kind of spoke to, but at a truly sort of conformist stage, we see authority in position. So, like you said, maybe we turn to the president, but you didn't say like the specific president. You just said the president, and there's a kind of you could say it a truly sort of ethnocentric or conformist kind of, and that's a terminology from the stages model, um, stage where we're really in a kind of concrete collective stage where it's a collective orientation, and it's at a sort of a visible, explicit collective, you could say. So we look to the position. So the authority comes from not just from a person who's an expert, but who's a person who's in that position. It's the position that's granted authority. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and then the expert is a little bit different because that's someone who's like actually developed knowledge. So that's sort of the beginning of a kind of more subtle, abstract thinking. Like anybody can be an expert, right? They just have to gain the expertise. So that sort of already kind of breaks the hierarchy a bit, but they kind of, in the earlier stages, they kind of get fused because usually the experts are the people who get those positions. But it's really at that point, it's like, okay, we're starting to think for ourselves. Like, I don't know the answer, so I turn to the expert. It's very similar to turning to the president. But then what we start to do is we start to understand, like, oh, I can be the expert. Like I have my own thoughts. I'm doing my own critical thinking. I'm using my own reasoning and my own abstract thought and my own observation about the world to discover my own mind. And so we begin to question. And so I think your question had to do with how you navigate that. And one of the really just kind of disorienting dilemmas of that navigation is, one day you were embedded in a system, everything made sense. You had the thoughts, the views, the beliefs, the myths, the understanding of the world that really came through that community, through the authority of that collective. And one day, you get up in the morning and you're drinking your tea, and all of a sudden your mind is racing in another direction. You're realizing you're having all sorts of conflicting thoughts with that. And, you might be able to put those out of your head for a while, but what's happening is your mind, your subtle mind is really becoming aware, and you're starting to have all these ideas, your own ideas that are unique. And we often have it in relationship to our family. You learn all the stories about your family, about what happened and who your parents are and who everybody is growing up. And all of a sudden you think, half that stuff I heard wasn't true. It was people's stories about what happened, and you start to have your own ideas. And so at that point, at that point, it's kind of the birth of rational consciousness. Not to say that earlier stages are irrational, but that this is the stage of development associated with modernism, with science, with critical thinking, with the idea that we are each observing a world with our own, mind and making critical distinctions and understanding, theorizing, testing our understanding, seeking the truth. And so the truth then becomes the authority, and nobody really holds that. It's ultimately up to us to discover, and the experts are involved with that, but it's not experts that have been given authority through the hierarchy or the system. I'll just pause there and see if that's speaking to what you're wanting to explore.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. It brings up for me some thoughts in my own journey as I've thought about. There was a time in my life where I gave deference to the authority simply because they held that position. And so when I would go to them, I was even afraid to ask the difficult questions, because who am I, right? Who am I to go to the authority and to ask them a challenging question and to push back, right? Like I sensed it was inappropriate. And so there was a level of respect and deference to the position that prevented me from even asking the questions. And then I can distinctly remember when like this light bulb switch goes on, and I suddenly realize like, oh, like if I do that, I'll never get to ask the questions. There'll always be somebody in the position. There always will be this deference. And so I come to a place in my life where I'm like, even if I make that person uncomfortable, even if there's risk of whatever it is, rejection, pushback, shame, whatever all those things are, I'm going to ask the question anyway. The other thing it brings up for me, I'm going to let a medical vehicle drive by. All right. So the other thing that comes up for me is this idea that we can also see others reducing our voice, or we might reduce the voice of others by requiring them to hold the position. In other words, we often can get into conversations about very important issues, and we decide who gets to play in the sandbox and who doesn't by whether they have a college degree, or whether they hold a political office, or whether they are a position of authority in law enforcement or in the judicial system, or because they're an adult. And hence we're a 16-year-old and we don't feel a right to be able to challenge them. So I see those things play out in my own life. I'm curious maybe if you have a story or two that you want to share of how that's played out in your own, so that people can also see maybe another example of when that light bulb goes on and you begin to see authority differently.
Yeah. Well, um, yeah, it's a good question. You know, yeah, I mean, I think really to me, Bill, it's really been an ongoing process. You know, it's a it's really been an evolving process for me, and there's been many stages to these shifts that you're talking about, and I think the part of the as you're talking about this may or may not speak to what you're talking about, but as you're talking about it, what keeps coming to mind is my dad. And I think in my own life, I associated authority with my own experience of my father, and and part of my own journey or my own growth has been, I don't mean just my father, but just the idea that there's older people in positions of power, and because they're there, they really know what they're doing, and they know more than I do, and just like you say, these sort of positions of authority, and the more I've evolved and grown, and the more I've spent time with people, and maybe the more I've gotten older, the more I see that as really a construct. That the people in authority, and in some ways being in a position of authority, holding power, is a very limiting context. So part of what you're speaking to here, I think, is starting to get into understanding of context, which really takes it a stage beyond this, just having your own mind of things, but understanding that we see the world from different perspectives, and we can project on the world views of authority and power, and in doing that, we can limit our own power and our own authority. I think I'll just pause there. I don't know, Bill, if I have a really good kind of story, but one might come to me in a minute, and if it does, I'll bring it back.
When when one hits these, so in spiral dynamics or in integral theory, and I'm only vaguely familiar. I'm only maybe a little intellectually aware, but not really lived the experience, if that makes sense,
Yeah.
in it. So I understand like the diplomat stage, and I understand the individualist stage and the expert stage, and what comes along with a little bit of that. Now, when someone's in a system, and by system, I mean, again, we're talking maybe specifically in a religious system. But I want to at least make note that this happens in a school system. This happens on a football team.
Right.
It happens in a family. It happens in just in a culture, in a country. As people begin to take their authority back a little bit, where they start to say like, oh, I have something to add to this. I have a view, and my view is valid for for whatever reasons I deem it valid. And just because I'm not the expert doesn't discredit what I'm having to say. When people do that, there's a ton of pushback. Again, we live in systems that say, hey, you have to look a certain way. You have to follow certain rules. You have to stay within these boundaries. And some of that keeps us safe. Some of that is to maintain order and control. And we get that. But on some level, the moment you start to think differently than the accepted way the system has lined out, you immediately begin to get pushback from the system. The system often will, especially in religious systems, the system will shame you. It'll begin to label you with terms that point to you being an outsider and having to fix something about yourself rather than open the system up to any type of criticism. That places one emotionally in a precarious position when they're dealing with those kinds of emotions for the first time, where they sense like, oh, I hold this new ground, and this new ground isn't acceptable to the system that I live in.
Right.
And if I'm authentic, I'm going to lose some sense of belonging. And that brings, man, does that bring angst and turmoil? Any thoughts from you on, I know part of it is you just have to sit with it. Part of it is you just have to live into it or lean into it. But do you have any other thoughts on if people are experiencing that for the first time and don't know exactly what it is, and it's hurting and it's causing fracture in relationships and they're beginning to be deemed an outsider, what are some suggestions for things they could do or should maybe try doing to kind of live into that?
Yeah, it's a really good and really important question. It's there's a way in which the particular developmental shift you're talking about, this can be very poignant, right? But let's just kind of zoom out and look at big picture for a moment. Like if we're evolving beings, right? Then we're going to change. So if you and I are in a relationship with each other, if we have a friendship or we're in a community together, what happens is that community it often assumes you can think of it kind of like we made an agreement for you to be you and me to be me. You're like, hi, how are you? Oh, you're you, I'm me. Okay, let's be you and me together. But then one of us changes. Right? We start to think differently. We start to look differently. And all of a sudden that breaks that whole agreement. That creates turmoil. And you go, oh, wait a minute, I thought you were like this. And now all of a sudden you're like that, and so what happens is this really occurs throughout development. But the thing is that as we grow to learn the process of development, we become much more comfortable with it. But it's a challenging thing whenever we change. Right? Like change is beautiful and it's good. It can also feel threatening. It feels like if I'm going to change, what's going to happen to my marriage or my family or my community, or maybe I won't want to do the same kind of work anymore, or the things that I thought were important will shift. And that can be threatening because we want to feel like we're part of a community. So it's not just an outer system that's preventing us from being ourselves. It is also within us, that changes can be challenging and threatening. And so one of the things that's really, really can help is to understand more about development. So I would just, like what you've done to study it and to learn how the stages work and demystify it, super, super helpful, because then all of a sudden you can realize, okay, we're evolving. Same, not just individually, but collectively. We can understand like, oh, I'm part of this system, whether it's a religious system or an organization. And we can say like, okay, well, here we are, 2018, this is how it's working. In 10 or 20 years, it might be different, so then when we start to see things happen, we don't have to think that they're just a threat to the system, but we might say, oh, this might be changing happening. And we might have to tolerate some ambiguity and some tension. And so learning about development, number one, is super helpful. The second thing I would say is it can be really helpful as you change to find like-minded people that understand what you're going through, that kind of, which I think, as I understand, is kind of part of what you've done, Bill, is you've allowed yourself to go through your own changes in the community that you've been in. Correct me if I'm wrong, but then had people who kind of, who identify with that and kind of say, oh, this is interesting. I feel similar. I've had similar experiences, so that you not to abandon, your existing communities, but to also have people who reflect and validate and understand and support you in what you're going through, who can be a system of support. That's also really important. And to do your own personal development work. To, growth, human growth is like any kind of growth, right? If you want to become a better basketball player or a better guitar player, it's important to get support, to practice, to take lessons, it's the same thing with human development, to actually discover what would support me in my development right now. What are my own learning edges? Where do I have blind spots? And to ask for help, to seek people who do this kind of work and to get support in your development. Those are some things that I think are helpful.
Yeah, good stuff. So now here's where my own understanding is going to stop, and I'm going to share a question that I have that I truly am wrestling with and trying to understand. And I think it is a difficult question, because I think you'll understand when I give you the question in a moment. But some people can do this, some people can't, and it isn't always because of capability. Sometimes it's what the system is asking of us. And so my question is this, which is, it specifically in religion, we grow up with stories, as you pointed out earlier. Those stories we come to find out are myths, and as we learn that they're myths, we sometimes grow frustrated with what we perceive as betrayal, like the system sold us something and that was a false bill of goods. And so as we deconstruct that religious system, and again, I'm being specific there, when we deconstruct that religious system, we often start to see the trauma and the harm that it causes to others. And so we become an advocate for change. We become an advocate for healthier mechanisms. We become an advocate for more appreciation for diversity. So if you grow up in a church that's, say, anti-homosexual, for instance, and as you become an adult in later stages, you start to give space for oh, they're human just like me, even though they're different than me. And we start to see value in human beings, even when they don't make the same life choices, nor could they, that we do. And so we start to push back against our system, asking it to be kind and to be nice. Some systems, we are in a place in its history that we see enough change to justify staying. And for others, we see the trauma as being too great, and eventually, like myself, we end up outside of our tribe, whether we removed ourselves or the tribe removed us. In the later stages, people seem, at least in my conversations with others on development, people seem to get to a space where they have the ability, the wherewithal, to step back into their religious system. It's not that they believed again, at least not literally. They still understand it's myth. But somehow they're able to go back in, even amidst the harm that the system does, and do what they can from the inside, but without it having the emotional drain or the trauma being imposed on them as they go back in to be back in that community, knowing full well that it doesn't match their own values and ideals. And I wonder maybe if you can speak to that, because it's a mystery to me. And I see people, you and I have a common friend, Thomas McConkey, who's done that very thing. And I look at him and I don't know how he does it. And I'm just curious if you can explain what it is that happens later on that allows someone to go back into a system, even with the differences and the trauma that's happening around them.
Right, right. Yeah. It's a really good question. And, when we develop, there's a kind of dialectic that happens, right? Which is, if you want to think about it in stage development, in terms of stage development, when we grow, when we step forward, there's a part of that process which is pushing away where we just were, right? I want to take a step forward. So part of the process is rejecting the place that we just were.
Yeah, there's an aversion to that
Right.
stage just behind us.
It's a differentiation, right? So it's like, in order to become a toddler, you had to reject being an infant, right? in order to become a socially, integrated child, you had to reject being an egocentric toddler, right? There's nothing, there's no one who's less tolerant of a stage than the one that's just moved beyond it, right? I remember when my older son sort of started to move into his rational consciousness stage, and his younger brother was still like just acting and dressing and doing all the things that his friends did, and he was still in that kind of diplomat conformist stage, and he just had nothing but contempt for his younger brother, his older brothers sometimes do, because he couldn't believe that he was just doing what his friends told him to do, but he was doing that just a couple years earlier. And so part of what happens is when we grow, there's this tension and this angst and conflict that we're trying to resolve on ourselves of the thing that we just left. And so, I'm sure you would be fine to go work with infants. You don't have any problem with that stage.
I'd have more patience
even
now.
Though
Yeah.
at a certain point, you had to push it away. So it's kind of no different, in a way. Like, so one thing is like you can think about one developmental theorist described this as a kind of dialectic. So we differentiate from the last stage, and then when we move beyond that, we integrate the two previous stages. So we're constantly separating and integrating and separating and integrating. So over time, we can part of the process is always looking back at everything that we've grown through and looking at the earlier stages and finding them in ourselves and coming to be compassionate and embracing of them and understanding them better. And so that's the first point I would say. The second point is, everybody has their own kind of journey, right? And I spent years, working in entrepreneurial environments in the technology business, and I had my own kind of painful experiences and got it through my system and wanted to move on from it. I don't know if I would go back. I could, but I don't know if I would. So we each have our own kind of purpose and path in life, and for some, it's not going to be to go back. It's not that you couldn't, but it's just not where life is calling you, and. Tom is a really good example, but he also had to veer away from his tradition for, a couple decades before he moved back into it. And I don't think that that's inevitable, but it also does show, that as consciousness develops, we become more integrated and more embracing. uh, yeah. So I think I would say that, uh, my ultimately, Bill, my own sensibility that, that I seek to live from is really just being embracing of everything. I kind of sometimes have a, kind of a thought experiment. Like if I could decide to be born right now in 2018 and live a life here with everything that's going on here on the planet, with all of our, development and all its various different places, war, poverty, um, environmental collapse, confusion, all of that kind of stuff, enlightenment, science, everything we got going on. Would I want to be here? And it's a big yes for me. I love this existence and everything going on with it, and I just understand that we're all growing and evolving here and learning, just like everyone who's in a religious system or a tradition. And we have to really honor the whatever trauma or pain or injustice that we've experienced, and not turn away from that, and not bypass it. Respect it. Give it its due. It's real.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. To hand out trauma to others, or to have trauma imposed upon us, is also just to be human. Like there's no way to be a human being and avoid trauma, both giving it and receiving it.
Right. And when we say that, we're speaking in a kind of broad perspective. But you would never say that to someone who was suffering from trauma, right? So you wouldn't say, "Hey, that's just part of life," right? Because that's real. So it's the both and of that bigger picture, that we're evolving, that this is part of life, and that there is that just to respect the actual real lived experiences of people who've been through it, and to be responsible for that, to right injustice, to make, to stand for inclusion, to, all of the things that are inspired by that awareness.
Yeah, I think as you say that, what comes to mind is this idea that once I recognize that trauma, both giving it, that I was at fault for giving trauma to others, and that I had received trauma at the hands of others, both intentional and unintentional, both ways. It brought in me a place where I moved from sympathy to empathy, where instead of just saying like, "Oh, that's too bad," like, pull up your bootstraps and get back at it. I got to a space where I could stand next to somebody and put my arm around them and say like, let me sit with you with this. And um, it's amazing, as you point out, as we dive into this transformative journey and we understand the stages. There's so many skill sets that come with it, that things as you pointed out earlier, like these changes aren't little tiny changes. They're really big, and they feel like we grow into them so slowly. And yet when you look back, like when I look back at where I was a decade ago, the changes have been so deep and transformational. And so I appreciate you kind of opening up that space and allowing me kind of to have some of those thoughts of things that have changed with my own life. I want to wrap up, and I could do this all day, by the way. I love development, and all of these questions, there's 100 more. But the one I want to wrap up with is this idea of myth. And so all systems build their stories on myth. And we like to think like, no, like some stories are real and some aren't. Like George Washington and the cherry tree. The cherry tree's a myth. The $20 bill in my pocket is a myth, because it's just a piece of paper with ink printed on it, and we've assigned meaning. And that meaning is only what we culturally have assigned. It's only a piece of paper with ink on it. And even what a piece of paper is, or what ink is myth. So religious systems tell stories, and they tell those stories as if they're literal, and they impose them that way. And for many of us who go through this journey, we begin to sense that some of these stories are myth. And a lot of people, when they recognize that, when they say like, oh, that's just made up, it isn't true, they walk away from that myth or whatever myths are particular to their system, and they leave them completely behind.
Mm-hmm.
And yet there are other people who seem to say like, and maybe I'm asking the same question in a different way that we just talked about, but it seems like some people have the ability, and again, I'll just point to myself. And I'm not speaking for anybody, so I don't know where you stand religiously, so I don't speak as if like my truth is yours. I hope you understand that.
Yeah.
But in my world, in my paradigm, I've deconstructed religion completely to the point where I understand that all religions, again, to me, all religions are myth. They're all mythical stories. And yet, for some reason, I still love to swim in those waters. I love, even though I have serious, and I want to say serious doubts, but if I'm honest, I'm just going to say I don't think like this Jesus guy rose on the third day, but I'm still deeply enveloped by his story. There's such human truth inside the myth. My question to you is maybe your own personal thoughts on continuing to utilize myth even once you figure out it's myth, and what maybe the difference is for those who still feel attracted to swim in those waters even once they realize the story isn't literally true,
Right.
versus people who walk away completely from the story and no longer sense it has any usefulness at all.
Right. Yeah. Well, it's a lovely exploration and question. I think one thing I would want to leave you with and leave everyone with is that in my own experience and in my own belief and intention is that each of us has a kind of inner wisdom available. I have often experienced this in my life as centered in my own heart, and that has allowed me to navigate these questions. So I can share some thoughts on your question, but I actually trust that everybody who's sincerely engaged with those questions is navigating them already and is evolving to where they want to go and where they're meant to go in their life. That kind of stepping back from myth and looking at what's true or not true is a necessary stage to go through on our own developmental journey. The development of that sort of critical mind. And now, if bringing back what I said before about the kind of dialectic of growth where we push away what's happened before, one of the ways that we can have healthy growth, Bill, is to understand that that's a natural tendency and not to over-exaggerate it. To say like, oh, yeah, you're challenging beliefs and looking at what's really true. Cool. That's natural. And it's, it's not necessary to fully abandon where you've come from, or to disengage from it completely. It's part of life, right? So, part of what we do too is you could say development is a kind of, it's a kind of shifting relationship or experience of, or interpretation or construction of the world and how we are. So those stories, the stories that we carry on of Jesus, we can have evolving relationships to them. And, one of the things that really struck me once is I think it was the religious scholar Reza Aslan who showed that, what we think of as religious literalism is really only like 200 or 300 years old. When I heard that, I thought, oh yeah, okay, I get that. It's really kind of an expression of that early modern consciousness, right? And one of the points he makes is that, I mean, the editors of the Bible put together a book that has all sorts of conflicting stories in it. It's like a modernist would sit down and say, okay, which one of these is right? And they would put it in Google Docs and, work on it until there weren't any contradictions in the story. But his point is, his belief is that actually, like what we think of as stories now from the modern perspective is so grounded in this question of, is it true or not? That we grew to work with things on a literal basis, but really early on, stories were never meant to be literally true. That's his point. So it may just be like a temporary stage we're going through with those myths, where we really wrestle with, the truth claims in them, and then return to seeing them more as stories, and that we seek a source of meaning in them, and so on. I think an interesting thing to think about too, Bill, is, if this is all evolving and we're shifting in how we're seeing the stories, is there something that's like true through all of it? Is there something that's there? And to me, there is. There's, our own development and how we see the world. If it shifts and changes, there are essential qualities and aspects of life that we're relating to throughout all of that. For example, love. This is something that we experience at all stages, and community, creativity, spirit, the higher potentials. These are things that are there in our journey throughout, and we evolve and shift in our relationship to it. So religion and science and commerce and everything grows up through that. But there's something that we're engaging with here. And I think this is a message that's important to me, because what's often at the heart of these things, like, for example, religion, something's at the heart of that's for the people who are experiencing that and engaged in their religious community and life, is so, so profoundly important, that when we talk about, oh, well, you can grow and you can sort of see that as myth, actually, I think the essence of it, my experience is the essence of what's most important, you can carry throughout life. You can still see it as myth and still have a spiritual life, still have a relationship to a higher power, to however you want to see that. And so it's important for me to say that too, that as we evolve, there's essential, dimensions of experience, of human experience, and of our life that we're engaging with us, that are part of the journey, no matter how much we evolve. And the things that are most important to you, you can have faith that they'll be with you. And the things that you need to let go of and move on from and shift and change, you can trust that process and allow them to change.
Yeah, I love when you mentioned towards the beginning of that you just trust people to live out their journey in ways that are best for them. And I agree, like, maybe in some ways the questions I've asked try to almost push into a space of like, hey, this guy's doing it right and that guy's doing it wrong. And I didn't mean it that way. And I know, like, there's an important truth there, which is to just trust the wisdom inside people, and to let them live out their journey differently than you and still know that it's valid, it's honorable, as we just trust human beings to do the right thing for themselves and to lean into whatever it is they need or don't need.
Well, sometimes when we trust that inner intelligence, it prompts us to engage in a conversation with someone we disagree with. So it's complex, but my feeling is that there's something guiding us in our own, there's a kind, however you want to, whatever story you want to tell about that. There's a kind of innate wisdom or there's an innate path that we're each on, and it's ours to discover it and to follow it and be true to it. And it sometimes isn't comfortable, but it will dog us if we avoid it until we take the steps that we need to take and be true to it. So that's kind of the thought I have on that.
Yeah, we're all in our own way, kind of on the hero's journey.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Lovely.
I just want to wrap up asking for listeners who want to know more about Pacific Integral, or if there's other resources you think would be useful, can you maybe just help the listeners know how to find out more, or to reach out to those resources?
Yeah, well, obviously, I mean, I just invite people to, be in touch at any time that in any way that you want to. You can find me and all of us here at Pacific Integral at pacificintegral.com. And we would be happy to speak with anyone about this kind of work or what we do, and to be of support in any way we can, and to invite people who really want to take a kind of deep journey in this kind of work to look at the Generating Transformative Change program. There's a lot of different organizations out there doing this kind of work. Tom's work is great. The work of my partner Terry O'Fallon is in the developmental model is really interesting work. But it really depends on what the needs of the specific needs of people are. There's we've been influenced by the work of Ken Wilber, the integral philosopher, and also the work of Otto Scharmer, who works in social change in his practice, which is called Theory U. Those are also really amazing resources and communities of people doing practice. Yeah, make friends, keep faith and heart, and just dare to follow your own wisdom.
Beautiful, beautiful. Geoff, Fitch, thank you so much for the conversation today, and I'll put links up on the episode notes to Pacific Integral, as well as some of the resources and individuals you mentioned. I just want to say thank you for your time.